I'm here today wearing my other and lesser-known hat, and that being the Chief War Planner and Attack Planner for the Kabukistan Air and Cyber Forces, because I want to explain to you why we are going to attack your infrastructures should the need come. And he's partly responsible for this as well. I'm going to give you two executive summary slides right up front. First of all, I want to talk about why. Why infrastructures have always been targeted and attacked. This isn't something new to the cyber age or 2012. And the reasons for that are fairly straightforward and simplistic. One, I want to degrade the enemy's capability. And some of that capability is physical. I want to go after fuel, telecommunications, energy, et cetera, et cetera. And some of it is virtual. Some of it is knowledge. What do they know? How do they share that knowledge, et cetera? I want to ensure that my OODA loop, the good old Boyd cycle, observe, orient, decide, act, is smaller and tighter than the adversary's OODA loop. And that includes things like command and control, includes things like PSYOPs, or what we now call MISO, Military Information Support Operations, and influence and propaganda and all that good stuff. Because what I want to create is FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, and confusion, both in the mind of the adversary's populace and in the mind of their leadership. And that means that civilians are going to be affected. If you think that you can have a bloodless or a civilian-less cyber war, you better think again. Because all of the infrastructures that have been attacked kinetically in the past and that will be attacked cybernetically in the future are at heart dual-use infrastructures. They involve civilian capabilities and military governmental capabilities. There is no way around that. It's always been that way with kinetic attacks that go back to World War II or even earlier than that. But one of the things it raises here is the threat of what about nation-state actors? What about non-nation-state actors? The threat of terrorism, cyber terrorism, especially going after new things like a really target-rich environment, the smart grid, whenever that happens. And we'll talk about that in more detail. What I want to do this morning is very quickly go through three major pieces of stuff. One, I want to talk about something which is probably inherently obvious to all of you. Why are infrastructures critical? What makes them critical? And are some more critical than others? Then I want to walk through the historical record because, as Bob warned you, I am a military historian, and I got lots and lots and lots of historical examples, and you are a semi-captive audience. And finally, I want to turn to what may or hopefully is rather new to some of you, the concept that Bob and I have been working on for a couple of years, I2O, Infrastructure and Information Operations, and extending that into the topic of cyber war, because why would someone want to do this, and why would someone want to use cyber? First of all, what makes infrastructures critical? You've probably all seen much of this before. One very widely accepted definition that you see up here is something that if you incapacitate or degrade it significantly enough, it's going to have a debilitating effect upon the adversary's national security, their economic or military stability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is not the same as mission essential. I mean, the banking and finance system on a national scale is a critical infrastructure. Okay. The federal payroll system is not a critical infrastructure. My bank account is not a critical infrastructure. Do you understand where I'm going with this? At the macro strategic level, they're big things. Once you get narrowing it down to the individual or the organizational level, that does not make, even though the effects could be really, really bad for me, that doesn't make it a critical infrastructure. And this is a little bit older than the computer revolution, because that was a critical infrastructure, the Roman road network. That Roman aqueduct in Spain was a critical infrastructure. These have been around for a long, long time. But we've kind of subdivided them up into pieces. Core infrastructures, the ones that you just can't do without, and if you lose some of that, you start feeling the effects very, very quickly, like instantaneously to minutes to hours. And there really aren't many ways that you can backfill that. Some of them are things that are essential, and the information infrastructure, as probably all of you realize and are inherently involved in, is a critical underpinning for how the rest of this stuff works. This slide, and some of you probably recognize this, is fairly old. It goes back to the mid-1990s. It goes back to the Marsh Commission, the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. It's given to me by a friend of mine who was one of the commissioners, Brent Green. Some of you may know Brent Green. And the point to make about this is that when we start speaking of critical infrastructures on a national level, they are internetted and they are synergistic. And if I really want to do something, if I can get at whatever the point of synergy is there that has spillover effects into things on either side of it, that's where you have the real bang for the buck. Have you seen something like this before? This is the whole basis for the industrial web theory of air power and targeting in World War II. Like I say, we've been doing this for a long, long time. This comes from Scott Borg, the Cyber Consequences Unit, and I've highlighted in yellow something that I like to point out. Whereas the electric power industry is a relatively minor direct piece of gross domestic productivity, what's the impact over here on the rest of it if something happens to the electric grid? And the answer is the whole thing turns into a shambles. Same point, somewhat less case for fuel and energy, somewhat here for telecommunications, telecoms and internet. The reason I show you this is because of this. This is from the second of the 4 editions of this study that has been done by the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. This is the 2004 one. The 2008 one expands it to 25 countries and 7 international organizations. And here's the point I want to make. 2 points. One, big block red up here. Everyone considers those 3 things I just highlighted on the previous slide to be absolutely essential. Money, telecoms, and energy, especially electricity. If you lose those, your national capability and society starts falling apart very, very rapidly. Interesting, now this chart is, of course, idiosyncratic. There are national level perspectives on these things that are absolutely nationally unique. For example, this one on the bottom. Who cares about water and flood management? As it turns out, only one country. You can very well guess which one that country is. It's that place there that kind of lives underneath the level of the North Sea. Keeping the water up there and out there is really important to the Dutch. So what makes a critical infrastructure critical to any different nation depends very much on what that nation's context is, what their interests are. Okay. What's the historical record? We've been doing this for a lot longer than people think we have been doing it in ways that people never imagined. That right there is a piece of the undersea telegraph cable that went from Santiago, Cuba, out, eventually ended up in Spain. It was the strategic command and control mechanism or medium of the end of the 19th century. And I show that because we cut that cable during the Spanish-American War. It's a very, very interesting story. That started in process, something that continued on in much, much greater detail and effectiveness in World War I. The Brits studied what we did in 1898, learned from it, and started planning. They started planning so that if they ever did go to war with those guys down there, they were going to act against that country's national capability to use that communications medium. Notice here that this big red line, that's the British backbone. You notice what countries it goes through or goes to. And every one of them was British owned, operated, or a member of the British Commonwealth. They recognized that this thing was of strategic importance to them. Thus, in World War I, they acted. The British cable ship Alert, within the first 48 hours of World War I, sailed out in the channel and cut the undersea telegraph cables that connected Germany to the outside world. And why did they do that? They did that, among other reasons, so that it was the first act of the propaganda war. And one of the things I want to impress upon you is do not fall victim to the trap of separating the technological from the non-technical. They did the technical cutting so they could have a non-technical influence impact. You have to think about these strategically and synergistically. And I won't go into detail about all this stuff. If you want more detail, go look at the work that Jonathan Winkler has done. I think he's at Wright State. The book that he published, Nexus, the article he published in Journal of Military History, et cetera. It's a fascinating story, and it's an example of how one country, the British, at the start of the 20th century, recognized the importance of this infrastructure for their national security. I come from the Air Force. I was actually looking forward to having General Matthews here so I could say we come from a service that has made its livelihood, was founded upon the basis of chopping up infrastructures, except that we did it not with cyber, we did it with 500-pound bombs in World War II, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the work, August 1941, before we actually went to war, and the work of Air War Plans Division, their first plan, AWPD-1. And highlighted in yellow, disrupting German industrial infrastructure. Yeah, there's that big I word, by getting at these three things. Have you seen those three things on a couple of slides in about the last 5 minutes? There's a reason why they always show up there. This is August 41. A little less than 2 years later, when Casablanca comes out and we've been at war for a year, the relative clarity and simplicity and focus of that turned into this. And if you were operating an industry in Germany and you weren't on that list, you were pretty much a mom and pop organization because everything else was on that list. And the point I'll make down here is if everything is critical, can anything be critical? And if you think back to one of those graphics I just showed you, how many critical infrastructure elements are identified in the American concept? What's the number now, 18? In other words, everything, including monuments. How monuments are critical infrastructure, I don't know, but we've got them categorized in there. If everything's critical, how can anything be critical? The reason I point that out is, here's an example of something that worked, and next slide, something that didn't. German oil, a critical infrastructure. We recognized it right up front, and when we finally got enough airplanes going against it, meaning in about 1944, what happens to the German fuel supply? It bottoms out to the point where they couldn't fly airplanes, couldn't drive tanks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's an example of an infrastructure identification, analysis, and attack that worked. Here's one that didn't. This is the German electric grid. And if you go back a slide or two, you remember AWPD-1 said German electricity. And if you go into Casablanca directed, it's somewhere buried down there inside of it. And the point being, this comes from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. It was never a target. And down here, it was vulnerable. It would have had a dramatic impact if we had struck it, but we did not. You have to do the analysis and then carry through on the analysis. Jump forward to an earlier life. The high point of my Air Force career came in August 1990 when I, with a group of about 6 or 7 other guys working for John Warden, we built the concept we called Instant Thunder that became the strategic air campaign against Iraq in January, February 1991. And when you look through here, the essential target sets, I've highlighted in yellow. Have you seen those before? There's a reason why telecoms, electricity, and fuel and transportation keep jumping to the top of these infrastructure target sets. It's because the society and the military can't function without them. This was John Warden's concept for, just planning. This is an extrapolation of that and gets into the issue of what are the nodes in here, in which doing something to one element of infrastructure has spillover effects onto something else. When we finally fleshed out the plan, in yellow, how do we isolate the Iraqi regime? There's telecommunications, there's C3I. Down here is infrastructure, there's oil and distribution, and here's an expansion of the bit on telecommunications and command and control. We recognized right up front we had to affect that for strategic purposes of the regime. the growth of the target set, analysis of the strikes. This all comes, I was the division chief for something called the Gulf War Air Power Survey that we formed in 1991. We issued 5 plus 1, 6 volumes, 6 books, about yay long on your bookshelf, analysis of air power in the war. And very, very detailed, very objective analysis. It has stood the test of time in terms of looking at that target set and what we did to it. This is electricity. And I'll give you an anecdote. It has to do with the importance of identifying your objectives, and it has to do with communicating those objectives to the people who actually do the planning. When we first started doing the planning for Instant Thunder, we recognized that electricity, Iraqi electricity, was going to be a critical objective. We needed to knock it out. We also had the mindset, which turned out to be wrong, that the regime was going to collapse and that we wanted to be able to go into Iraq quickly afterwards and rebuild the electric system so we get it back up and functioning. Somehow that mindset never made it to the 03 and 04 letter level planners and operators who actually did the targeting. And so when we sat down with a group of targeteers when we were writing GWOPs and brought up this issue, we wanted to leave the generator halls standing and not rubbleize them so we could rebuild quickly. They looked at us and went, "What are you talking about?" And the result of that was we took the Iraqi generator halls, places you see identified here, and turned them into smokes of rubble. It took years, decades to rebuild them, and some of them have not been rebuilt yet. You have to be able to identify what you want to do and get that analysis to the people that are actually doing the work, doing the planning, doing the targeting. This graphic just reflects, similar to what you saw with German oil, the impact on the Iraqi electric system within like about 36 hours of the start of the war. It disappeared and stayed down for the rest of the war. Now, again, historically, we have always targeted electricity, always. Even if we didn't carry through in World War II, the Germans even had a plan in 1943 to go after parts of the Russian electric grid that were supporting Russian armaments industries northeast of Moscow. And the reason it didn't work is because the Red Army overran the air bases. But the German plan was to go after electric grid using television-guided, precision-guided munitions to take out the power plants. The Germans, 1943. We did it in Korea by going after hydroelectric facilities and dams. We did it in North Vietnam. The Israelis have done it in Lebanon almost consistently for the past 3+ decades. We've done it here, and we did it here as well. Electricity has always been a critical, targeted infrastructure in war. But we've usually done it by going after the hardware and blowing up the stuff, places where you make electricity, if I can use that phrase. I want to suggest for you that when you look at things like smart grid and when you look at things like cyberspace and cyber war, that's not going to be the process. The process of going after smart grid are its controls. How does the system work? How do you control the generation? How do you control the distribution of electricity through a system that is as complex as this is? To try to take this whole thing out would be impossible. I want to go after the brain and make it stop working there. A phrase that many of you, rightfully so, will react quite negatively to, because I do as well. We've heard the phrase electronic Pearl Harbor for, boy, I almost want to say generations, but at least decades. And let me get at the reality of it, looking at it from a historical perspective. Any of you come from a background in the United States Navy? Anybody? Okay. You can tell that if you're the owner of that battleship, you're in deep doo-doo. When the water's up to the gun barrels of the main turret, bad things. That's the Italian battleship Cavour at anchor in the harbor of Taranto, down inside the boot of Italy, which the Royal Navy went after with a nighttime torpedo attack using Swordfish torpedo bombers in 1940. November 1940. Keep the date in mind. This is the British chain-home radar mast, which was probably the key element in the Brits winning the Battle of Britain against the Luftwaffe in the summer and fall of 1940. 1940. Jump forward a year, and there's the USS Oklahoma, battleship, shallow water harbor, torpedo attack from airplanes. That's the SCR-270 radar that was up on the north shore at Opana Point. Many of you have probably seen the movie Tora Tora Tora, and there's a rather famous scene in there which I have used in my classes, and it's a mischaracterization, because there's a scene in there where the guy's up at Opana Point at about 5 minutes after 7, just after they're supposed to shut down the radar site. Hey, there's a bunch of airplanes on the scope that coming from out there. And they call it in to Pearl Harbor, where some Air Corps lieutenant answers the phone and goes, don't worry about it. They're probably B-17s. And I have said for quite a while that what if that young lieutenant had said instead, oh my God, it's the Japanese coming to attack us. What could we have done about it? You're shaking your head no. You're correct, but for the wrong reason. On Sunday, December 7th, we could have done nothing. If they had attacked on a week earlier, they would have been slaughtered. Because for the entire month preceding that, the Hawaiian Islands, the whole chain, had been up on an elevated state of readiness. They had a combat information center manned and operational. They had the radars operating. They had search patrols out. They had a fighter direction center that was operating. They could get fighters up into a place around the island within about 20 minutes. And then on Saturday morning, they took the weekend off. I came from the Strategic Air Command. We never took a weekend off. Here's the point. Along with that, what else happened? The big guys couldn't agree on a couple of simple manning decisions on who would be responsible for providing the personnel to man the Combat Information Center, Army or Navy. And so they deferred the decision. This is at the flag level. The guys at the 04 level are saying, we got to do this, we got to do this. But at the flag level, they couldn't make the resource decisions, about half a dozen flipping guys, which led to this. After the attack, Admiral Kimmel, the Navy commander, it was quoted as saying something along, I'm going to paraphrase here, well, I really didn't understand how this radar stuff was going to operate. Guys, we just had an example a year earlier of how important it was. I sure would rather learn from somebody else's lessons than having to learn them myself. Maybe Estonia, maybe Georgia has lessons to teach us. A great quote from George Tenet, which goes back at least a decade, and something which I have been using. Don't ever use a capability that you don't know how to defend against or protect against. And I'm going to raise the question right now for the rest of this morning, is that where we are with cyberspace? So let's go to the third part. Bob and I published something, what, 2 years ago? Something like that. We called Cyberspace and the First Battle in the 21st Century Warfare. And it's a part of a concept that we call I2O, Infrastructure and Information Operations. Again, I'm a historian. In customary, traditional 20th century warfare, because of strategic space, that means time and geography, you had the ability to lose big right at the start and still come back and win. France, 1914. Pearl Harbor, 1941. The Russians, 1941. And still had the ability to come back and win. And what we're going to suggest for you is that in cyber war, that strategic space is gone. The strategic space in cyber war may be no more than nanoseconds. And that if you lose the first battle in cyber war, you may never get a chance to recover from it, because it might be over before you even know it's been fought. And because of impacts on critical, and again, I'm going back to the point I made way back at the start, critical but non-military infrastructures, and things that affect things like mobility, movement, logistics, supplies, command and control, etc. And if you want this thing, there's a webpage for it. Some of you may track what the DoD has been doing with information operations. That's really what I teach here at NDU. Been doing that since 1994. We have a new definition of it. If you're familiar with the old one, which looked at information operations as essentially the 5 core competencies of PSYOPs, OPSEC, deception, 3 things that Sun Tzu wrote about, along with computer network operations and electronic warfare. Flush that from your mind, because that definition and that approach, thank goodness, is gone. This is the new definition. You'll notice it makes no reference to specific capabilities. It says information-related capabilities, and nowhere will you find a definition of what those capabilities are. To do these things here in protecting our own. It includes, obviously, computer network operations. Can we use trons? Can someone else use trons to create the kinds of effects that we got by going after places like this is the Basra generating plant, which became a bomb dump in 1991. Can we use the trons to do the work that we used to use laser-guided weapons or sometimes non-even guided weapons to do? So what we call I2O is this. Combined with other types of military operations and fought largely but not completely in cyberspace. And one of the things that we want to try to drive a stake through the heart of is this discussion of the cyber-only war or cyber-only battle. In our opinion, the real world always trumps the theoretical world. And the real world means that you're going to see both cyber and kinetic events and actions. And I'll show you another perspective of that in a couple of minutes. There are some important advantages here to the first mover. Call it first strike in cyberspace if you want to, but there's some important potential advantages to that actor that strikes first for a bunch of obvious reasons. If you don't, you might never ever get another chance to. And there's no real way to protect against it. You can limit the damage from it. There is no real way to protect against a World War I artillery barrage of your positions. There were ways to counteract it by defense in depth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This may be the determinant for who wins. Again, what may be attacked? In almost every case, we're talking about dual-use infrastructures that are owned and operated by the private sector, by the civilian world. Because who owns and operates energy? The private sector does. Who owns and operates transportation? The private sector. Who owns and operates telecommunications and computers and information communication technologies, et cetera, et cetera? The private sector does. And so they are a necessary partner in the attempts to protect. I'm not sure that all the members of that partnership see it as clearly as that. And from a military perspective, we in the United States, we will comply with the law of armed conflict. Others, not necessarily. An interesting sidelight, my friend James Mulvaney, who is, in my opinion, the number one expert walking the face of the earth on China. And James argues that the Chinese are firmly convinced that we, the United States, are the ones responsible for Stuxnet. Why? Because nobody was hurt. And only the Americans care about that. Nobody else cares about collateral damage and who gets hurt. So since no one got physically, et cetera, only the Americans did this. Interesting sidelight, perhaps, on thinking. Cyberspace and warfare. The offense has some enormous asymmetric advantages. The cost of creating offense is dirt cheap compared to the cost of creating defense. I am not for a moment trying to suggest that creating the offense is easy. No. 6 kids in a garage in California on a lark on a weekend are not going to bring down the North American electric grid. Flush that kind of idiocy from your minds. Real, serious actors, and I'm talking about terrorists, and I'm talking about nation states, may very well be able to do stuff like that. But they have the resources and the time and the motivation to put into it. Is this a weapon of mass destruction? And I cringe every time I hear cyber described as a potential WMD, weapon of mass destruction. It might very well be a weapon of mass disruption, and it might very well be a weapon of precision disruption or destruction. Stuxnet may very well fall into that weapon of precision destruction box. Carnage may not be the objective of the adversary. Of a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda probably is, of a nation state that has to live with us afterwards, that may well not be their objective. Chaos may well be an objective. This is a lot bigger than just defacing websites. That's what gets talked about in the media all so often. That's child's play. This is not about defacing websites. This is about causing strategic effects that can be very difficult to model, that have very uncertain outcomes. And that lends a degree of restraint, I believe, to this, which I think is a good thing. You don't need to necessarily be aiming at national collapse in order to achieve strategic effects and strategic results and affect the balance of nation-state operations, especially if you combine these with kinetic attacks, which is clearly the way that the Chinese are thinking. And I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. What are the virtual seams between functions and organizations? And I'll tell you a story. In 2007, just a few months after the events in Estonia, I was part of a small group here at NDU that had a chance to meet with President Ilves, the Estonian president. Came to the United States, and the question that I was able to pose for him in the meeting we had was, how effectively did your partnership work, the public sector, private sector partnership? And his answer was fascinating, because his answer boiled down to, sometimes smaller is better. Yep. He had 5 guys, literally. And he said, go in that room, figure out what to do, can't come out till you got the answer. I'm locking the door. And about an hour and a half later, they came out and said, we got the answer, and they did what they had to do. It had some nasty impacts on the Estonian society for a while, but they knew what they had to do. In the United States of America, and some of you are very, very familiar with this problem, in the United States of America, you would have 5 times that number of organizations, and they'd all try to be muscling their way into that room with their trains of lawyers behind them, so they make sure that their organizational budgets and equities, et cetera, were protected when trying to do this thing. I'm trying to get our graphics people to help me do a graphic of the American war elephant. It's an elephant with 4 heads, 8 tusks, 16 legs, faces in all 4 ordinal directions simultaneously. And if you manage to get yourself underneath the legs of that elephant, you will be trampled into atoms. Most of the adversaries we keep running into are nimble enough that they can stay out from underneath those legs. That's this issue of the virtual seams. A couple of years ago, there was a cyber conference held down at Maxwell Air Force Base by the Air Force. I was one of the speakers for that. I think it was General Bill Lord, who was going to be the commander of Air Force Cyber Command before the Air Force changed its organizational model on this. And Bill said, you know, what keeps me awake at night is not the threat of data denial, the black screen. What keeps me awake at night is a threat of data manipulation. It's the screen that I look at and go, oh my God, that's not right. And then you start going, how long has it been like that? Who else is using this data? And that's a really sick feeling. That's data manipulation. Have we seen the effects of that before? Does anybody remember the Dutch hackers? In fall of 1990, a group of Dutch computer hackers, High Tech for Peace was their name, offered their services to Saddam Hussein for 3 million Swiss francs. He turned them down. But they were inside of about 3 dozen American computer databases and networks and systems, et cetera, et cetera. This is 1990. This is 22 years ago. And I've had American logisticians tell me that when they realized or were informed that someone was inside of their stuff, what did they do? They stopped. They stopped their deployments, they stopped their shipping, et cetera, but you had to go back and validate the data. Well, where are we then as compared to now, or I should say now compared to then, in terms of our dependence upon digital data and transmission for everything we do. If you're not familiar with it, there's something called the TIPFIT, Time Phase Force Deployment. That is the American version of the German railway system, 1914. That's how we get from here home to the other stadium, because when we play away games militarily. And getting there depends upon this stuff here. Others understand that pretty well. Just like air power, you need access, you need a vulnerability to exploit, and you need a payload to deliver to cause the kind of effects that you want to create. And so what would be the objectives of such an attack? Well, first of all, getting at the infrastructure, getting at their infrastructure, or they getting at ours, especially things like logistics and supply chains, especially when it's the American military that has to pick up and move a whole bunch of stuff someplace else to be effective. It's a target. Secondly, how do I get inside of that OODA loop that I mentioned earlier? Observe, orient, decide, act, and slow down what the other side is doing, which, if I can slow them down, automatically makes me faster in comparison to them. How do I impair their ability to move? How do I keep them from doing the same thing to us? How do I create opportunities to do things to them at the strategic level that will have beneficial effects for me? Remember earlier I said it's not just about the technical, it's about the human as well. How do I use the technical cyber to get to this, to get at the social cohesion and political will of the adversary, both the military and the civil populace? How do I shape the way the world is looking at what's going on, especially in a frame when the time gap between action and effect is measured in nanoseconds? The Chinese have been looking at this for years. And I'm not trying to say for a second here, I'm not trying to fearmonger or be too pokey at the Chinese, but this is some stuff that they've written and published. And there's nothing wrong with it. This is good strategic thinking. They keep talking about local war under informationized conditions. And I don't know what in the world, how to precisely define informationized conditions, other than meaning the understanding that the information environment has become dominant to everything that they or we do. How do I control an adversary's information flow so that I achieve information and electromagnetic dominance? That's a foot stomp on the term electromagnetic. In many ways, what's important here isn't cyber, it's the electromagnetic space, which is much, much bigger than cyber. They have a strategy, Integrated Network Electronic Warfare, INEW, which is a blending together, synergizing three pockets of operations: electronic warfare, computer network operations, and kinetic strikes. In the United States of America, as I've heard it described in our military, in the struggle for preeminence, whatever kind of word like that you want to use, between the electronic warfare world, and I'm a member of the old Crows, and the cyber world has won that. And the EW people think that they're fading off to be a little rustic people in the woods and ignored by the big cyber machine. In China and in Russia, the reverse of that has happened. The electronic warfare world, but of course they see that much more expansively than we do. The electronic warfare world won, and cyber is a subset or a segment of that. That's a very important distinction between them and us, because their targeting objective, and they're very explicit about this, is how do they prevent the enemy, the adversary, the high-tech opponent, from, first of all, being militarily effective in the theater, and secondly, and maybe more importantly, reinforcing that theater. They do not see this as a war-fighting capability. They see this in a preemptive sense as a war-winning capability, that by using these capabilities effectively and intelligently, they can reach their military political objectives and never have to kinetically, conventionally fight the high-tech opponent. That's an interesting and very nuanced and subtle view of the world. And so, one more executive summary and we'll wrap up here. go back and tell you what I told you. Why? Because infrastructures have always been attacked in war. Have always been, always will be. And they've, for these reasons here. And the other point, and I've added something, it's this bottom line that Bob and I have been arguing. This is inevitable. It is going to happen. There is no way that it won't happen, because for two reasons. One, every country larger than Kabukistan out there is developing some kind of cyber capability, because everyone recognizes its advantages and its usages, and because we and others, we, United States, are becoming so dependent upon this stuff that no attack planner in his or her right mind can avoid not coming after it, because the benefits will be so obvious. And with that, here's how you reach me. Here's what we do here, but here's what I do. And in case you didn't realize it before you walked in here, you've now become part of our Borg. And with that, I've left about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, or rocks, or spears, or tomatoes, or whatever. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to your recitation of history, I'm just curious about why there was a disconnect during World War II about eventually bombing the electric infrastructure. Was this just an oversight?
That's a great question. I've published on this, and I still don't have a really good answer for that. I think that what happened was, and it's really interesting because if you go back and read the stories of the guys that built AWPD-1 and the history of that first basic air concept, they put electricity in there because they looked at us. They looked at American electric networks and grids, especially in the East, and said, you know, if you mess this stuff up, the whole dang society stops working. And this is in about 1938, 1940, 41. So there was a realization on the part of the small handful of people that did the initial plans that this was really important. Somehow, that did not carry through into the bigger planning effort, especially in 1943. And by January 43, it may be obvious to us that read the history books now that the Allies were going to win. It wasn't obvious to the people who were fighting it. And so, to them, the overriding important moment was, remember, January 1943 is about 6 months before the turn of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. In January 43, the U-boats are still winning. And so, taking out German, U-boat operations against that critical Allied infrastructure, the sea lanes, was actually number one priority. And then to be able to operate over Europe and to be able to get onto Europe, you had to have air superiority. And so how do you get air superiority? Well, they were going to go after the fighter plants and all that stuff that made airplanes. They were focused on a bunch of very, very critical but very immediate objectives. Even though most of German electricity was in the western part of the Reich and reachable by bombers, the air planners then thought it was going to be too difficult of a target, and they needed to hit this other stuff first. And then they just ignored it. It's interesting that when the United States Strategic Bombing Survey was put together, and they got real industrial experts in there doing the analysis, then they did that one paragraph that you saw that said, this was a mistake. We really, really needed to hit this target set. It would have had dramatic and almost immediate impacts, but they didn't do it. It's a good question, and I don't have a very good answer for it other than what I just laid out. Yeah.
Being made available.
Your slide. As far as I'm concerned, they should be. By the way, I think Bob mentioned that the conference is operating under Chatham House rules. In my perspective, anything I say is out there. You can quote me. And if you want slides, email me, and I'll send them to you. This actually comes from some of the courses that Bob and I teach and have been teaching for a couple of years.
With respect, first off, thank you. With respect to the critical infrastructure always being attacked and targeted, would you agree or disagree that cyber is somewhat different in that the interconnected nature and interdependent nature changes what the targeting calculus one considers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would agree that it changes the targeting calculus of what you're going to do and what its effects is going to be. And in some ways, I think it magnifies the need for really, really well done analysis in terms of, if I do this, what's the downstream and what's the second and third order downstream? I got to use Bob's favorite word. What are the concatenating effects of doing something here? If I do something to this piece of the electric grid, what does it do to transportation? What does it then do to finance systems, et cetera, et cetera? And so the operational and targeting analysis of the network is really critical. As you saw in that one graphic, I talked about smart grid. And some of you probably are far more expert in terms of the American electric grid than I am. It's really in three pieces. There's a western grid that is roughly from, I think it's from the Rockies west. There's an eastern part, which goes all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rockies. And then there's Texas. And Texas is unique because it's kind of self-contained. Its production is roughly balanced by its usage, and so it's kind of a self-contained grid, although it does feed back and forth. Electricity is one of those really, really critical things because you can't stockpile it. You can stockpile oil, you can stockpile coal, you can stockpile ball bearings, the Germans did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can't stockpile electricity. You produce it as you use it, or you use it as you produce it, but the ability to stockpile it just isn't there. And so if you can get at the productive capability, which is what they would have had to do in World War II, which is what we did in 1991 in Iraq, or if you can now, and smart grid I think really lays out a dangerous thing here, if you can get at the distribution and control mechanisms, you can have some dramatic effects, and you might not need to turn off every light in the United States from the Mississippi River east. You might be just able to go to the one specific place you need to go to and keep it from functioning or keep it from getting anything. You might be able to apply a fair amount of precision to this. Yes?
Is there any indication that the Chinese actually see this as a precursor to a direct physical attack? I know I'm kind of extrapolating from the idea there, but or is their goal more to push us out of their sphere of influence kind of thing?
And I'm going to read a lot into this. I think that's more accurate. I think the Chinese, and you need to talk to a Chinese expert about this, which I'm not, they don't see this in terms of direct confrontation with the United States. They don't want that. They want to avoid that. One of the pieces of Chinese strategic thinking that I keep hearing is don't kill Americans. They're sensitive to what Bob and I call the Yamamoto effect, which is if you kill 4,000 Americans, they are going to hunt you down to the last set of bushes and get you. Don't do that. If the scenario we've laid out here, and there's a scenario that's in First Battle in Cyberspace, if you look at it, and it doesn't use any particular country by name, but it is based upon, it's predicated upon a scenario where one big country, what do we call it, Ruritania? Yeah, Ruritania wants to take over another, a much smaller neighboring place, an island that we called Zenda. And if you know 19th century British Victorian romance literature, you recognize Ruritania and Zenda. And then there's this other big country we called Lusitania. Symbolism's terrible. That has promised to aid the Zendans, but darn it, they can't get there because of this stuff for about a week. At the end of which time, Zenda has changed hands. And Zenda has said, never mind, this is fine. We're perfectly happy to be the 17th or 19th or 33rd province or whatever it is of Ruritania. In fact, we're actually going to stay in place as the leadership, so everything's fine, go away. I think that's a plausible way for someone else to think. And what that raises is the objective is not to fight and win a big conventional war against the other side, is to keep the war from happening at all, yet still achieving your objectives. back there and then up.
I'm looking at this both from a military perspective, because I'm former Navy. In World War II, Pearl Harbor was bad. It could have been worse. You know, don't put all your assets in one place at the wrong time. And yet, I'm watching now in critical infrastructure, we're tearing down lease lines. We're throwing everything onto routers using the same protocols. So, how do you balance all that now with? I want it cheap. I want it economical. I'm not going to care about certain risks against the Dan Gears monoculture problem of the big risk.
You've raised
Great issue, a huge issue, a horrifying issue, in that, and you've all heard this model before, in the race between security and convenience, we keep voting on the side of convenience. In the great race between redundancy and cost effectiveness and efficiency, we're always going to vote for cost effectiveness and efficiency. Who owns and operates all these infrastructures? Not the redundancy. The owners and operators are the private sector, who are focused on increasingly narrow and tight, bottom lines and budgets and stuff, et cetera. And so there may not be a good answer to that question of we have been headed for 2 decades down a road that keeps emphasizing the convenience and the ease of use and the profitability side of the equation, and we as a government and as a military are putting more and more and more of our military security eggs in that basket. I don't have a solution for that. Carlos.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned there might be a sub-second window to defend overreact from a cyber attack when it happens. And with advanced persistent threats, that window might have already happened, might have already passed. So what are your thoughts on the balance between finding institutions that are already there and protecting against new institutions?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I did an interview for the BBC last year, and I made the argument that there's 2 things that really worry me. One is the terrorist threat, because they just want to hurt. In fact, the causation of hurt is their primary means to get to their objective of political impact. When I look at the nation-state threat, and it goes back to the discussion that we just had, I'm much less worried about the causation of massive hurt than I am about creating very specific, precise, and focused effects that have military implications or results. I think from the nation-state perspective, unless you're talking about World War III, which I'm not, that's a different bag of donuts. But if I'm talking about limited war for limited political objectives, et cetera, I don't see some other nation-state, and you can, Kabukistan or whatever you want to use, as trying to drive us into the dark ages, because that works against their long-term interests of working with and living with us. I see them as something more precise and focused. Like, I want to keep the United States from reinforcing this area for 10 days, and that's more focused. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think Bob's about to give me the hook and throw me out. Do we have time for one more back there?
Good, last one.
Can you comment a little bit more about the social dimension? I mean, the social dimension side, it's hard, but to what extent are you incorporating into your curriculum and trying to understand how people are going to react in these contexts?
You brought up, I think, a really good point.
If you go back to August 14th, 2003, did anybody attach any significance to the date? Well, that afternoon at about 1:30 in the afternoon, I had a group of 150 brand new students from National and ICAF in here, and I was doing marketing for our courses and program, and I was talking about this issue of infrastructures, et cetera, et cetera. And then they left. And 2 hours later, as they're driving home from their first week here at school, what are they hearing on the radio? The electric grid has collapsed. That was the most successful marketing event I ever had for students, because they came up and said, we didn't know what you were talking about, but when you predicted it and it happened, we figured we better take your courses. And I've been trying to have that happen ever since then and failing. But the point being is, when you look at the aftermath of that, it was an electric outage. It was a power system failure. No, we've done that before. And yet, the New Yorkers, once they realized, okay, this isn't terrorism, this is just the grid went down, duh. They behaved magnificently. They walked home and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, within about 3 hours, 4 hours of it happening, you had two heads of state. You had the President of the United States and you had the Prime Minister of Canada on the national media reassuring everyone, don't worry, this is just the grid has a problem. Why would you have the President of the United States going on TV to tell 250 million Americans that it's just an electric grid problem in the East? Because of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and because of the social implications. If we had not been able to do that, if the word started going out that this was caused by the Chinese, or worse, given the date, terrorists, you wouldn't have seen that orderly walk home out of New York City. You would have seen panic. And so that's one of the potential implications of this. And if you can get a society to start panicking, you will then get that society's political leadership to start reacting to the panic and not to whatever strategic issue they're facing or dealing with. This was my pleasure to do this. I'll be around. I'm going to drink some more coffee and need a donut or something. And please come up and poke at me if you want to. Bob, thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan.